Shadow Hack. Chapter 971, Heavy Sword Li Zhou. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu turned silent and began to recall the bits and pieces of his old life and his destined immortal weapon. While Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu thought about those things, 2 teardrops streaked across his face without him realizing it. The memories prompted him to share his experiences with Li Yunmu. His heavy sword had been called Li Zhou, which was also the name of his wife. The people of the world knew that Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu loved his wife, but they didn't know just how deep it went. Before Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had attained his glory, he had made the other emperors feel a sense of crisis due to his terrifying innate aptitude. At that time, he had been the number 1 person below the Emperor realm and was very proud. He didn't place the Emperor realm powerhouses in his eyes, but no one could say anything about it since he had the capital to do so. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had battled 4 famous emperors with an immortal realm cultivation and successfully killed 3 of them while the last one fled in defeat. Those events established the brilliant reputation of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. But it also alarmed all the other Heavenly Emperors. If he was so terrifying at immortal realm, then once he stepped into Emperor realm, would anyone be able to deal with him? After that, the emperor who had escaped previously acted as the leader and brought 5 emperor powerhouses to take action and jointly attacked Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. They didn't even hesitate to abandon the dignity of powerhouses and arranged a killing spell to wipe him out completely. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu didn't know about the scheme and was spending his days with his wife in peace when he suddenly detected an attack full of killing intent. It shattered their house, angering him to no end. The Emperor powerhouses didn't intend to give any opportunity for Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu to escape and directly unleashed the killing spell. One after another, crimson blade tips rushed toward him. He noticed the danger, but there was nothing he could do to avoid it. At that moment, Li Zhou rushed forward. She was also an immortal realm powerhouse and was the second young miss of ancient spell clan. She saw through the core of the killing spell and knew what she had to do. The core of the spell was created using 1,000 types of metal, so it couldn't be destroyed without the combined strength of 2 people. However, Li Zhou belonged to ancient spell clan and could destroy 10,000 formations with her blood essence. In that desperate situation, she charged toward the spell and forced out the blood essence from her entire body. It left her extremely weak, but the large spell was destroyed. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu saw his wife lying on the ground, blood rushed to his head and his eyes turned red. After the Heavenly Emperors saw that things were far from encouraging, they anxiously went to fight themselves. But how could they contend against Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu? Soon, 3 of the Heavenly Emperors perished. When the remaining powerhouses saw that, they fled in defeat. But they soon discovered that not only was their strength incomparable to that of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, his speed was also superior. Another Heavenly Emperor soon perished, but just when Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was about to settle the matter with the expert who had plotted against him twice, the sect backing that expert arrived. He stopped his pursuit then and retreated to take care of Li Zhou. Once he took hold of her, the Heavenly Emperor who had been able to escape released his most powerful attack. It rushed toward Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's back like a viper. Upon seeing it, Li Zhou in Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's bosom struggled free from his arms and became a shield to protect him. The attack pierced her chest, and Li Zhou spat out a mouthful of blood. At the sight of it, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's eyes went wide, and he was ready to risk his life there and then. But a tender and white hand pulled at him, and he looked at Li Zhou. Her complexion had turned deathly pale, and her body was incomparably weak. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu could already sense her vitality draining out. "I'm tired, Ryukyu. Let's go to a comfortable place," she said in a weak voice. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's eyes filled with tears as he heavily nodded and left with Li Zhou. While retreating, he turned around and looked at the pursuers behind him, etching each and every one of their faces into his memory. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu found a small town in a remote place and circulated his energy to heal Li Zhou. Nothing helped, however, since she had used all of her blood essence. She had also received a fatal injury, which meant that she was on the precipice of losing her life. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu used up all the medicines in his possession, he looked at the weak Li Zhou, then turned around and left to purchase more elixirs at the fastest speed. After he left, Li Zhou opened her eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips. She then forcefully stood up and pulled out a furnace from her spatial ring and an incomplete sword. She arranged a few spirit stones in a spell formation, and a flame slowly rose up in the furnace. Inside it, Li Zhou placed the heavy sword, which was the heavenly sword she had been forging for Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Once he attained the Emperor realm, he would be the number one person in his realm. But before she could finish it, many things had happened. Li Zhou clearly knew the terrible state of her body, so she intended to give Ryukyu a farewell gift. Flame temperature insufficient. The strength of materials is also insufficient. Li Zhou was softly murmuring to herself while carefully observing the furnace. The heavenly sword was transforming, but she was in despair because many of the materials were still in their old house, so the refining of the heavy sword was about to fail. I definitely cannot let it fail. This is my last treasure for Ryukyu. Li Chu's gaze filled with resolution. Suddenly, she thought of how she had been nurtured by her clan from childhood and how her body had already reached the peak of the mortal realms. Her gaze hardened as she decided something in her heart. A letter was swiftly written, and a sparkling tear fell on it. Soon after, Li Zhou entered the furnace without any hesitation, even if feeling some reluctance and sadness. The flame in the furnace became even more vigorous then, and Li Chu's blood and flesh slowly refined the heavy sword. After she used her own body to forge it, it began to emit a powerful presence. Originally, it was only a mortal weapon, but because of higher level refining, it broke through to become an immortal weapon. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu returned, he became very anxious when he didn't see Li Chu's figure. His gaze then fell upon the letter beside the furnace, and he walked over to pick it up. My Lord Ryukyu. I know my body the best, and I'm aware that I don't have much time left. I have refined a heavy sword which will make you the most powerful person in your realm. Originally, I wanted to personally give it to you and see your joyous expression, but fate had different plans. But you mustn't grieve because I am present in this sword. When you will hold it, it will be like a part of me will be beside you. Although I won't be able to touch your face anymore, I will be able to join you in battle. You have to promise me that before you have sufficient strength, you won't be impulsive and go to find the enemy. Remember, I will be protecting you from heaven. Li Zhou. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu narrated to that point, his voice cracked. Who said that real men could not cry? Those whose hearts were broken could. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu named the sword after his wife and always carried it with him. It was by his side until he went to subdue the Ryukyu spirit pearl. After that event, the heavy sword disappeared forever. Chapter 972, Forceful Seclusion. Li Yunmu calmly listened to Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu talking about his past, but he couldn't help but be emotionally moved by it. Every man yearned for such a wife. What else could a husband request after marrying such a woman? At that moment, Li Yunmu was fully convinced of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's words. In order to subdue the Ryukyu spirit pearl, he didn't hesitate even when his heavy sword refined by his wife's body was destroyed. No man would dare to lie about something like that. Then why did you set up an evil formation like that spirit refining formation in the Yin Imperial Palace? Is it to resurrect and take revenge on those people? Then what's the difference between you and Yin Devil Sovereign? Although Li Yunmu sympathized with Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, it didn't mean that he could use his experiences as an excuse to commit unspeakable evils. Haha, I have already wiped out those people. The spirit refining formation wasn't set up by me, but the Yin Devil Sovereign, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu explained with a bitter smile. At that time, when everyone thought they destroyed Yin Devil Sovereign, they didn't consider that he might have hidden his soul in the Ryukyu spirit pearl. Because I used my full strength to subdue it, I also didn't see it until it was too late. After Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said that, his gaze turned red, and a monstrous hatred engulfed the place. The surrounding void turned red, and a wave of killing intent increased the pressure on Li Yunmu dramatically. That Yin Devil Sovereign used the opportunity when I had just subdued the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl and didn't have the time to recover to enter my body and make a nest for himself. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said with hatred. Fortunately, I had many trump cards in my hand, so I destroyed my body and kept a wisp of my soul in the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl. Moreover, I made it so that if my soul is wiped out, the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl will also be destroyed. Because of that, the devil didn't dare to completely erase my existence. As Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu spoke, his body filled with an aggressive presence. His words spoke of a true Heavenly Emperor of ancient times. Even if he had to destroy a great treasure, he wouldn't leave it for the enemy. It made Li Yunmu admire him even more. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu continued his story after some time. But when all's said and done, his soul was more powerful than mine, so he sealed me here and maintained the Yin Imperial Palace in my name. He laid down the spirit refining spell and massacred groups of innocents one after another to restore his soul. Fortunately, I secretly built a teleport portal at the end of the stairs because of which you were able to find me. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said that, his voice filled with helplessness and bitterness, and the surrounding environment also returned to the pitch black from before. It was my misunderstanding, senior. At that moment, all the misunderstandings that Li Yunmu had toward Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu were cleared. Moreover, given his conduct, it wasn't an exaggeration to call him a senior. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu looked at the change in Li Yunmu's behavior and nodded, without bothering about the previous misunderstanding that Li Yunmu had toward him. He was well aware that regardless of who was in Li Yunmu's place, as long as they weren't acquainted with his situation, they would think the same way. "Oh right, senior, why did you teleport me here?" "So that I can inquire about the situation in the outside world and check the strength of all the youngsters with potential. Even if Yin Devil Sovereign is injured, his strength cannot be underestimated. How could I just watch everyone in the younger generation with potential being sent off to their death?" Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said. When Li Yunmu heard it, his admiration toward Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu became even deeper. He cupped his hands and asked, "Senior, what do you think of my strength?" Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu smiled. "Far from sufficient. The Yin Devil Sovereign has already recovered his strength to Quasi-Emperor realm, so your present strength is lacking a little bit, so I decided to keep you here for seclusion." When Li Yunmu heard the words of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, he was dumbfounded. Seclusion? The place they were in didn't have anything, so how could he enter seclusion there? Could it be that he would be forced to meditate in the void until the time he was allowed to leave? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu took note of Li Yunmu's pained face, and he smiled and waved his hand. The next second, Li Yunmu felt a boundless pressure pushing the surrounding space toward him. He hurriedly circulated his energy to deal with it and found it a pain in the neck. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu smiled, and the next instant, his presence amplified. It meant Li Yunmu had to deal with an even heavier pressure. "Youngster, cultivating here with me is pretty good. I am not very severe, and dying here with me is much better than being killed by Yin Devil Sovereign outside," Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said with a wide smile. Li Yunmu clenched his teeth, but his breathing grew ragged because of the surrounding pressure. At that moment, he had already unleashed his full strength, but it was barely enough to resist being forced to his knees. As he held on, his soul got stronger and stronger. "Oh? You still have a little strength left. I want to see the exact level of your strength." Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu saw that Li Yunmu was surprisingly able to resist it, and his opinion of Li Yunmu rose higher. Previously, when he just sensed Li Yunmu's strength, he intentionally suppressed him. Apart from wanting to see Li Yunmu's limits, he also wanted to teach a lesson to this youngster for his misunderstanding. Although Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had said that he didn't mind it on the outside, if Li Yunmu thought of him not as the most formidable person of ancient times, but a two-faced Heavenly Emperor, he would probably spit out blood. Such an act was not the behavior of a powerhouse, but simply a child throwing a tantrum. I also want to have a taste of the power of a heavenly emperor of ancient times. Li Yunmu clenched his teeth, still not agreeing to yield. The two men had the same temperament, and it was part of the reason why Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu liked him so much. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's presence rose again, and Li Yunmu felt a sudden increase in pressure that made his legs go soft. They were about to bend. Li Yunmu roared at that moment, and the dark energy circulated in his body. He could not kneel. Even if his legs shattered, even if his life came to an end there, he could not kneel. With the support of the dark energy, Li Yunmu was again able to resist Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's presence. Afterwards, the two began increasing their strength, and the surrounding space started to crumble under their powerful presences. 1 week. 1 month. In the blink of an eye, 3 months passed. At that moment, Li Yunmu could already move unobstructed under the most powerful pressure. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was astonished by Li Yunmu's tenacity and potential. It has to be known that although he was only a wisp of a soul, his presence could still be compared to that of a half-step Heavenly Emperor. Yet Li Yunmu was still able to bear it. His aptitudes could be compared to his own, and it was extremely good. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu nodded in satisfaction. The child's potential was pretty good. Previously, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had only put on a bold face and chosen to take a gamble by nurturing Li Yunmu. But what caught him off guard was that Li Yunmu's potential was not only comparable to his own at the initial stage, but might even be slightly better. Chapter 973, Cultivating the Physical Body. At that moment, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's presence couldn't affect Li Yunmu in the slightest, and it was an extremely pleasant feeling. In a short period of 3 months, his soul's strength had surprisingly increased by 2-3 folds. This speed of advancement had never happened before, and the result of it was astonishing. It gave Li Yunmu a lot of confidence. Senior, given this situation, it seems like I win. Can I go out now? Li Yunmu curled the corners of his mouth into a faint smile and spoke while cupping his hands toward Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Why are you so anxious to go out? Are you satisfied with this little advancement? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said indifferently. When he saw Li Yunmu's anxious expression, it was as if he was looking at himself when he was a youth. Not so long ago, he also had the same appearance, not understanding the significance of grabbing an opportunity and trying to increase his strength as much as they could. He's too young. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sighed in his heart. Li Yunmu looked at Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Does he have other methods to increase my strength? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu didn't reply, but waved his hand, and a wave of energy appeared in the space. It ruthlessly rushed at Li Yunmu like a punch. Just when Li Yunmu thought of using his cultivation to obstruct it, he suddenly heard Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's voice. Don't stop it using your cultivation. Use your body. Li Yunmu hurriedly pulled the flux energy back into his body and put his hands in front of his chest. The punch then ruthlessly crashed into them. The power of the punch was enormous, and even after using his all to resist it, Li Yunmu was still pushed back a few steps. Before he could steady himself though, another punch struck him. Puff! Li Yunmu spat out a mouthful of blood. At that moment, he could clearly sense his 5 viscera and 6 bowels shifting their position. He hadn't expected that the punch which seemed ordinary and mediocre would surprisingly be so powerful. After all, his physical body's defense wasn't simple and was one of his strong points. Li Yunmu quickly sat down cross-legged and circulated his energy to recover from his injuries. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu looked at Li Yunmu's situation and stopped his attacks, then said with a faint sneer, Are you still deluding yourself into thinking that you can become the most powerful person of the immortal world? With such a garbage physical body, you would only be in existence at the bottom rung in ancient times. When Li Yunmu heard Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's taunt, his face darkened. How could he let Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu speak such words? At that moment, he became extremely determined to change his opinion. I will make you see that I am not someone to be trifled with. Li Yunmu quickly adjusted his breath, then stood up with his eyes red and said to Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, "Come again." Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu looked at Li Yunmu. Getting angry, hey? But that is useless. Facts are facts. In front of facts, even your bad temper is nothing more than fleeting clouds. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu changed the space again, and 3 successive layers appeared. Upon seeing them, Li Yunmu's eyebrows jumped. You really want to kill me? But Li Yunmu didn't circulate his flux energy to resist it. Instead, he used his lean arms to catch the punch. Right after, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu attacked again, and 3 of Li Yunmu's ribs were broken. By then, Li Yunmu had received 5 of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's attacks. His body was in a very bad shape, and his hands were shuddering. Some of his bones were broken again, but he repaired them so he could stand strong once more. Once finished, he rose again. Come again. After 3 more attacks, Li Yunmu spat out blood and retreated with a few of his bones broken. But after a little bit of recovery, he stood up while gasping for breath. His gaze remained firm. Come again. Puff. Come again. Puff. Li Yunmu spat out blood and retreated again and again, then stood up once more. The sight of it made Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's eyes jump. He hadn't expected that the youth's resolve would be so formidable. He finally understood why such a superior young talent appeared in a generation which lacked resources. It was because not only was he ruthless toward his enemy, he was also ruthless toward himself. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's aim was attained. If he continued, the youngster would be unable to endure and would receive a permanent injury. All right, we will stop here today. Did you find the elixirs I placed outside? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu asked. Li Yunmu looked inside his heavenly world. The elixirs he had collected from the Yin Imperial Palace hadn't been taken by his people, so he took out all of them. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu looked at the elixirs and shook his head. Those elixirs were still lacking a little, so Li Yunmu took out a pile of elixirs he had obtained from the outside world. But Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu still shook his head. Li Yunmu felt troubled then. His body was in extreme pain at that moment, and he was barely able to bear the pain. Knowing he won't be able to hold on for much longer, he clenched his teeth and opened his heavenly world for Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu to enter inside and find the needed object. Li Yunmu wasn't afraid that Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu would have some ill intentions. Given his strength, if he wanted to harm him he would have attacked a long time ago. There was no need for him to wait and plot. Moreover, although Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was very ruthless toward him, that was only to increase his strength. Li Yunmu had already accepted Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu as his master, so he didn't put up any guard against him. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu saw the trust Li Yunmu placed in him by even opening up his heavenly world, he couldn't help but be moved. In the ancient times, because of his formidable strength, others were always on guard against him. He never had any friends or experienced the trust shared between them. He hadn't expected, however, that after so many years, he would find a youngster who would place complete trust in him. Because of that, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's resolve became even firmer, and he decided to treat Li Yunmu as his own disciple. It made him even more motivated to find the required elixir for Li Yunmu in the heavenly world. But once Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu entered the heavenly world, he couldn't help but feel dizzy. Was the youngster a scrap picker? What were all those things? Beetle Emperor's buttocks, lava beast's mucus, what is this? Crap! This youngster doesn't even leave walls alone. Youngster, I really admire you. Don't you have any dignity as a powerhouse? Should an immortal realm powerhouse pick up things like these? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's face was filled with helplessness as he complained to Li Yunmu. At that moment, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu made a decision that he could never let the youngster tell the outside world who was his master. It would be too humiliating. Li Yunmu's consciousness also entered the heavenly world then. After seeing what was happening inside, his expression changed, and he anxiously said, "Senior, don't throw it. Those are good things." "What good things? How can you call this junk good?" "That's the saliva of an ancient dragon. It can be used to stabilize one's realm." "Beat it, I am gonna throw it." "You cannot throw it. I said throw it, so throw it." Chapter 974, Two-Faced Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. The two men were acting like two ants bargaining at a food stall in Li Yunmu's heavenly world. One of them wanted to throw the things while the other one wanted to keep them. Fortunately, the other residents of the heavenly world couldn't see them, or Li Yunmu's prestige would have dropped by a lot. At that moment, he was completely relaxed though. He always appeared as a cold and indifferent person in front of others, but for some reason, he displayed his original nature in front of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. It was most likely due to trust, however. Ryukyu had helped him like a teacher without any ulterior motive or greed for his treasures. He didn't have any bad thoughts in regards to his student. Li Yunmu considered Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu as the most trusted person apart from his parents and elder sister, so he didn't have any vigilance toward him and returned to the carefree days of Earth. Before long, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu found the herbs in the heavenly world and both of them came out. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu released a powerful pressure and lifted his right hand, where a sparkling clear flame appeared. He then threw all the ingredients into the flame. The flame divided into two, then into 4 parts, and before long, it had divided into 9 flame dragons. Each of them swallowed one type of ingredient, after which their shape began to change under the naked eye. They all turned into medicinal liquid. Afterwards, the liquid began to congeal in the stomachs of the flame dragons. Once they came denser, the 9 flame dragons containing the medicinal liquid fused together, allowing all the medicinal liquids to merge together. They slowly coalesced and began to take the form of a pill. The 9 flame dragons then began to revolve around the pill. Soon after, a medicinal fragrance spread out, and Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu withdrew the flame into his palm. The pill fell into his hand, and he went to Li Yunmu's side. "Eat it. I couldn't find some ingredients, so I had to use substitutes. I don't know if it will have any side effects or not," Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said to Li Yunmu with a sinister smile. Li Yunmu's face darkened, but his whole body was aching, so he swallowed the pill. Once it entered his body, it transformed into medicinal liquid and began to heal his body. During the healing process, he detected a lot of medicinal power moving around in his body. His bones began to itch, which was the sign of healing. But it was extremely difficult to endure the itch. Li Yunmu soon noticed that the itching in his bones was extremely abnormal. It even affected his soul, and the scratching of his skin did not help at all. Seems like the pill's side effect is an extremely abnormal itch. Apparently one cannot use life phase flower to substitute for life and death grass. Tomorrow, we should try using death phase flower. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu observed Li Yunmu's condition without any pain or joy. He just fished out a small notebook from somewhere and began to record the changes in Li Yunmu's body. At that moment, Li Yunmu's complexion was extremely unsightly. He had realized that the old codger was using him as a guinea pig, and the next day, he would change a herb and experiment on him again. When Li Yunmu thought about that, he wished he could chop Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu into pieces. 14 hours passed with Li Yunmu enduring the torture before the itching finally subsided. He heaved a sigh of relief after its disappearance and thought about how long the hours had been. Soon after, Li Yunmu began to check the situation of his body and discovered that all the bones that had broken the day before had been healed. A layer of green light was also wrapped around them. Li Yunmu stood up and said to Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, "Senior, quickly attack me. I want to see what has changed." Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu waved his fist and sent a punch toward Li Yunmu's chest. "Senior, you don't need to hold back. Using the previous level of strength is good. Li Yunmu sensed that the punch was quite soft and spoke with the belief that Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had been holding back. No need to hold back. This is the same strength as before. Haha, it was only so-so. I can still. When Li Yunmu heard that his physical body had surprisingly become so formidable, he felt complacent. But before he could say anything else, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's another punch came flying toward him. It crushed him without any resistance. Because Li Yunmu's physical body was very weak previously, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had only needed to hit him 5 times. Things had changed, however. After Li Yunmu's body had recuperated, his endurance had increased greatly. This allowed Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu to release his full strength. At that moment, Li Yunmu was again being beaten while Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu kept raining down punches from the sky, causing Li Yunmu to fly left and right. Soon enough, Li Yunmu knelt on the ground once more. He was in an even more miserable state compared to last time, since there was no part of his body which was left unaffected. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu narrowed his eyes and mocked Li Yunmu. You also are only so-so. Li Yunmu looked at Heavenly Emperor with eyes filled with hate, but couldn't do anything. Who had asked him to be so weak and get beaten like that? After that, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu again entered Li Yunmu's heavenly world. Very soon, a pill appeared in Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's hands and he looked at Li Yunmu with a treacherous smile. Eat it. I have improved the prescription this time, so it shouldn't itch like last time. Li Yunmu looked at the pill with a heart full of terror. Right then, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was no different from a pervert in his eyes, but because of his injuries, Li Yunmu still closed his eyes and swallowed the pill. Sure enough, as Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had said, Li Yunmu didn't feel the strange itch, but his complexion turned even more unsightly than before. It was due to an excruciating pain he had felt at that moment. It was incomparable to anything he'd felt before, and it directly attacked his soul. Li Yunmu was an extremely determined person, but even his forehead filled with sweat despite him not saying anything. Under his gaze which could kill anyone, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu took out a notebook once more and recorded his situation. After that, Li Yunmu continued to pass the days in a similar fashion. He was beaten up every day until he couldn't stand and then tortured by some pill created by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. But in the end, Li Yunmu was able to endure it without having a nervous breakdown and was able to withstand the tempering by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Once he went through the training, his physical body could not be compared to the past. His every movement released a powerful energy. At that moment, all the bones in Li Yunmu's body were covered in a layer of green liquid, like from the iron bones martial art Li Yunmu had cultivated previously. But his power right then wasn't something the trifling iron bones could compare to. It was a transformation in quality. At that moment, Li Yunmu could contend against several great principal golden immortals with his physical strength alone. It was also the reason why Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu became the most powerful person in the immortal world. He was much more formidable compared to everyone else despite the immortal world of that time being full of Heavenly Emperor realm powerhouses. Chapter 975, Martial Intent. Under the guidance of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, Li Yunmu's soul strength and physical strength advanced. Afterwards, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu also tempered his speed in order to make him the most powerful person in the immortal world. By then, Li Yunmu had been tormented greatly by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's methods, but at the same time, his combat strength had increased by leaps and bounds. It could be said that Li Yunmu could even battle against a Heavenly Emperor with his new power. But he was still somewhat lacking when compared to Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu at his peak. It has to be known that in ancient times, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu could wipe out all the Heavenly Emperor realm powerhouses of the immortal world. And the thing that Li Yunmu lacked wasn't physical, like strength, for it could be increased through training. There was one other thing which couldn't be taught using the same method, and it was intent. What was intent? Regardless of whether one was cultivating or sleeping, their mind and spirit could reach the state of unity, so real and ethereal would be in harmony. A person could transcend all the real skills and stop being limited by their movement. Such a person's every move, every attack would look unhurried and in complete harmony with heaven and earth, as if there was no ultimate move but rather each movement was a powerful technique. Intent wasn't something which could be cultivated in a single day or night. It relied on one's comprehension of the martial path. The more thorough the comprehension, the more powerful one's intent would be. It didn't have a material existence or limits. Swords had sword intent, blades had blade intent, so regardless of which path one cultivated, all of them led toward intent. The effect of intent toward advancement of cultivators was enormous. In a battle between a sword user possessing sword intent and a sword user not possessing sword intent, the victor would be clear from the start. That was how formidable intent was. But Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu wasn't worried about the lack of time. If Li Yunmu couldn't cultivate intent because he didn't have sufficient cultivation or time, he could be made to sit tight for a longer time. The true worry for Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was that Li Yunmu's Dao and intent may not be possible to integrate. The cultivation of intent depended upon whether true harmony could be achieved between one's cultivation method and the world, which allowed them to gain the approval of heaven and earth. Only after obtaining the intent from the approval of heaven and earth could one's cultivation be considered as a success. However, the problem was that Li Yunmu hadn't discovered his Dao. From the time he started cultivating, he had been doing things in the same manner, which was in defiance of heaven. If heaven wanted him to kneel, he wouldn't kneel. If heaven wanted him to die, he wouldn't die. The reason why Li Yunmu hadn't been successful in cultivating his own path was because the path he walked rejected the authority of heaven and earth, and it was called heaven-defying Dao. Li Yunmu's Dao didn't confirm with heaven and earth. As for the Dao intent, someone like him whose Dao didn't confirm with the natural laws became automatically unable to cultivate intent. It was the reason why Li Yunmu was stuck in the great principal golden immortal realm for so long. Without Dao being successful, intent couldn't be produced. This was precisely Li Yunmu's problem right then and the reason behind Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's worries. It wasn't that there weren't any heavy-defying people in the ancient times, but cultivating the heaven-defying Dao meant contending against heaven and earth. However, how could a mere mortal contend against the might of heaven and earth? Thus, those people were ultimately unsuccessful in their cultivation and perished, which was the reason why when Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sensed that the Dao cultivated by Li Yunmu was the heaven-defying Dao, he became extremely worried. The problem could only be solved if Li Yunmu destroyed his cultivation base and started from the beginning, otherwise, he would still have to contend against the might of heaven in the end. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu believed that cultivation relied on oneself, so he informed Li Yunmu about his apprehensions. Li Yunmu would have to settle them himself. After Li Yunmu heard the worries of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, he began to ponder over them. But the next second, he stood up and made a decision. What heavenly law? If it wants to obstruct me, then I will destroy this heaven. When Li Yunmu said those words, the presence of a breakthrough around his body amplified. But in the void, no heavenly punishment could descend. But at that moment, the heavenly law had placed Li Yunmu's name on the list of must-kill targets. As long as he walked out of the small world, heavenly punishment would descend on him. Li Yunmu had already attained the peak of Great Principal Golden Immortal Realm, so it could be said that if he came out alive after experiencing the heavenly punishment, he would become an emperor-level powerhouse. Unlike a quasi-emperor like the Yin Emperor, he would be a true emperor realm powerhouse. Furthermore, when the teachings of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu were also counted in, the day when Li Yunmu became emperor, he would be unparalleled in the emperor realm. But if Li Yunmu couldn't withstand the heavenly punishment, he could only leave the stage, or in other words perish. No one could change this outcome, not even sovereign realm powerhouses. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu couldn't interfere in these matters either. In any case, how could the mortals like them resist the punishment of heavens? All right, since you have made your decision, I will not stop you. But your present foundation isn't sufficient, and will become a source of danger when you contend against the heavenly law. In the coming days, I will assist you in cultivating your foundation to the pinnacle. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu saw that Li Yunmu had already made his decision and was aware that he couldn't assist him. But he still was going to do his best to help his pupil. When Li Yunmu heard the words of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, he solemnly nodded and stood up. He retreated 2 steps while facing Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, then went on his knees and kowtowed. He heavily knocked his head against the ground 3 times. Li Yunmu had never knelt before heaven or earth. He had only knelt in front of his parents, and at that moment, he knelt in front of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. In a short period of 2 years, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had spent a lot of time on him. Because of that, Li Yunmu had chosen to acknowledge Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu as his master. A master is like a father, so Li Yunmu was willing to lower his proud head in front of him. When Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu saw Li Yunmu's actions, he was extremely moved. He knew Li Yunmu's temperament. Even if he was in his peak state, he couldn't make Li Yunmu kowtow unless Li Yunmu was willing. So how could Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu not be moved? At that moment, he once more experienced human emotions after spending hundreds of years by himself in the void and decided that Li Yunmu was his inheriting disciple. Respectful master, requesting you to accept this disciple's kowtow. After Li Yunmu knocked his head against the ground, he spoke in a loud voice. Anyone who heard it could sense his respect for Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Good. 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 Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu praised him repeatedly, then helped him stand up. Right then, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu needed to seize every moment. He had already used a large amount of his strength, and his soul couldn't maintain itself for very long. But in order to assist Li Yunmu, he was willing to use the time he had to teach everything he knew. Chapter 976, Dao Perishes. With the passage of time, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's projection became increasingly more transparent because he continuously used his strength. But Li Yunmu, who was focused on his Dao, did not notice it. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu smiled and knocked his Dao intent against Li Yunmu's Dao intent, which hadn't formed yet. My path is Ryukyu's path, which exists in this world and transcends it. Without sadness or joy, where my Dao moves, all the Daos will scatter and no one can stop it. If I intend to defend, then everything will be peaceful. If I intend to kill, then all living things will be exterminated. Once Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu spoke, his Dao intent transformed into a sharp sword pointed at Li Yunmu's Dao foundation. The sharp sword was emitting a biting cold which caused the temperature in the surroundings to drop. Li Yunmu smiled faintly. My Dao is my Dao. It belongs only to me, and if heaven cannot endure it, then I will wipe out heaven. If this earth cannot tolerate it, then I will destroy it. The lives of all the life forms in this world and above depend on my mood. Li Yunmu's Dao intent also took the shape of a sharp sword and clashed against Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's sword intent, but it shattered into pieces swiftly after. What left Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu frowning was that Li Yunmu's Dao was extremely enormous, attempting to place itself above heaven and earth. It was the same as becoming enemies with heaven and earth, so when the time came, the Heavenly Dao would definitely use its most formidable tribulation to discipline Li Yunmu. The reason why Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu wanted to try and correct Li Yunmu's Dao was so that when he faced the heavenly tribulation, he would still have a chance to keep his life. But how could Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu know that Li Yunmu had thoroughly offended the Heavenly Dao? Regardless of how Li Yunmu's Dao changed in the future, as long as Li Yunmu stepped out of Ryukyu's small world, he would be facing the most powerful heavenly punishment, Purple Firmament Divine Thunder. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu continued with his teachings. My Dao cannot be obstructed by anyone apart from heaven and earth. I am the first person under heaven and earth. All the vegetation growing in this world is offered to me, all the evils in this world fear me, and I can walk tall across this world. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu wanted to assist Li Yunmu by reducing the sharpness of his Dao a little bit, but he hadn't expected that Li Yunmu would only have an indifferent expression on his face. In my Dao, neither heaven nor earth, only I can stand proudly over this world. If I want, then I will become immortal, if I don't want it, then I will become a devil. Who can stop me? This time, Li Yunmu's Dao intent transformed into a heavy sword, and the fluctuations coming from it were even more formidable than Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's Dao intent. It was unexpectedly shattered in an instant, which then struck his Dao foundation. A hint of praise appeared in Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's eyes, but the more formidable Li Yunmu's Dao intent was, the more difficult it would be for him to become an emperor. And if he couldn't even become an emperor, how could he become unparalleled in the immortal world? Everything under the starry skies serves the heavenly Dao, and my Dao is unparalleled, so how can heaven and earth be above me? Within this world, heaven cannot stop me and earth cannot obstruct me, so what's the difference? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu didn't agree to give up. He didn't want to obstruct Li Yunmu's Dao, but hoped to slightly curb his sharpness so that he would have a chance to survive when facing the heavens. But Li Yunmu didn't feel the same and said, "My Dao, how can this heaven and earth contain it? I desire that in this world, the heaven and earth would also follow my intent. If I want to leave, it shouldn't dare to obstruct me." Hiss. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu hadn't expected that Li Yunmu's thinking would be so far-sighted. The world they lived in couldn't satisfy him, so Li Yunmu's Dao intent wasn't something which Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu could hinder. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sighed. "With your Dao, if you don't defeat your enemy, you will definitely perish and fall into the abyss, unable to reincarnate for eternity. In the future, your name will be erased from this world. But then again, with heaven itself being your enemy, how can it be so easy?" Li Yunmu knew about the worries of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, but he still said with a faint smile, "If I couldn't transcend the Heavenly Dao, then what's the use of my Dao? There are no limits on the path of comprehending the Dao. I desire to attain even higher realms. If I die, so be it, but if I don't die, the Heavenly Dao will be under my feet." When Li Yunmu said the final word, his Dao intent transformed into a long dragon, which suppressed Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's Dao foundation. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's Dao intent was unable to resist for long and was shattered straight away. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu laughed bitterly. Li Yunmu's Dao intent was extremely deep. He was no longer able to stop it, so Li Yunmu would have to rely on himself in the future. At that moment, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's body turned even more illusory, and Li Yunmu finally noticed that something was wrong. "Master, what's going on?" he asked in a hurry. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu smiled lightly. "Nothing. I have been in this world for too long and have become tired." How could Li Yunmu not know the meaning behind Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's words? His master's soul was on the cusp of dissipating, which greatly pained Li Yunmu. His eyes turned slightly red. He hadn't expected that the master who had taught him so much in the last few years would leave so suddenly. He was extremely grieved by this fact and was ready to use everything he had in his possession as long as he could save his master. At that moment, he suddenly recalled the Ocean Monarch Stone he had obtained previously. It had the effect of healing the soul, but Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu waved him away. "Why are you panicking so much? With such an appearance, don't tell anyone outside that you are my, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's, disciple. Also, you can calm down, I am not going to dissipate for some more time. While I can still speak, I will hand some matters over to you." Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sighed. Li Yunmu truly thought of him as his master, but he had lived long enough, so he only shook his head. "All right, now carefully hear what I am gonna say. Since you have Ocean Monarch Stone, it means that the solitary ignition sword is already in your hands. But you must pay attention, the evil influence of the solitary ignition sword is extremely heavy. If you aren't completely confident in being able to control it, don't use it at all." Li Yunmu nodded repeatedly, still thinking of saying something, but Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's stern gaze made him keep his mouth shut and continue to respectfully listen to Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's teachings. I have placed the Emperor's goblet in this void. After my soul dissipates, you should take it. It contains all the comprehensions I obtained in my lifetimes and the cultivation essence I congealed. But it seems like you don't need to rely on me greatly. Your Dao is extremely special and cannot be influenced by external things. There's still the Yin Devil Sovereign outside, but he shouldn't be your opponent now, and given my understanding, he will naturally dissipate. The Ryukyu Spirit Pearl won't be destroyed, so after you leave and wipe him out, it could be considered as fulfilling one of my wishes. Throughout the speech, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's body turned even more transparent. Seeing this, Yunmu quickly took out the Ocean Monarch Stone, but Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu waved him away and gave a small notebook to Yunmu. It was the one in which he had written when concocting pills for Yunmu. This is my lifetime's comprehension on concocting pills, which I want to impart to you. Regardless of what you say, you are still partially an inheriting disciple, so you mustn't sully your master's title Medicine Emperor. Finally, I want to remind you that no one has walked your path previously, but I believe that you can definitely transcend this world. I'm done now. My time as your master is near end. After the last words, Heavenly Master Ryukyu's figure turned almost completely transparent. Only a vague outline of it could be seen, and Yunmu became even more sorrowful. System quickly come out. Come here and save my master. I don't need the experience points and space elements, just quickly save my master. Yunmu howled. 2 streams of tears were going down his face. It's useless, how can you save someone who wants to die? The system said with a sigh. Good disciple, master is going to see his wife. After so many years, master is tired. You must work hard and become an existence who can transcend this heaven and earth. Ha 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 ha. Chapter 977, Growth. Heavenly Dao, this old man has been your lackey for my whole life, so why are you still hindering me? This old man has one good disciple, and he will step upon you. Chou, I am coming to you. Yunmu knelt in the direction of where Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had disappeared and heavily knocked his head 3 times against the ground with 2 streams of tears flowing down his face. Master, have a good trip. After sending off Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, Yunmu's mood became much worse. He didn't move and kept kneeling without making any sound, without drinking or eating, nor even using his flux energy. Yunmu knelt like that for 3 days. After they passed, he slowly stood up and quickly found the Emperor's goblet in the void based on the directions provided by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. The Emperor's goblet was more than 8 feet tall and was releasing an extremely ancient presence. There were patterns in the shape of birds and beasts engraved on its surface. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had said that he had accidentally found the Emperor's goblet. After obtaining it, he nurtured it with his Dao intent for a long time and, with time, the Emperor's goblet took in his entire life's comprehension about Dao intent. When the Emperor's goblet sensed Yunmu's presence, its body began to shake, and a startling sound came from within it. The Emperor's goblet contained the essence of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, and it had already developed intelligence. Apart from not having a tool spirit, it wasn't any different from an immortal tool. Yunmu was a disciple of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, so the Emperor's goblet didn't reject his presence. When he stepped forward and touched it, it transformed into a small pendant and fell in his hand. A voice filled with vicissitudes of life spoke in Yunmu's brain, and he shed silent tears once more. The voice belonged to his master, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Youngster, although I don't know who you are, this Emperor's goblet is a magic tool nurtured by me using Dao intent during my life. Since you have found it, I should have already left this world. This Emperor's goblet can be considered to you, and you can also be considered as my disciple. I hope you won't let my lifetime's comprehension fall into oblivion. I hope that you don't disgrace this Emperor's goblet and will continue my Ryukyu Dao. If you aren't suitable, then I hope that you can find a suitable person for me. And that's it from me. Everything depends upon you now." After that, the voice disappeared. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu should have recorded his speech a long time ago, afraid that he might not be able to live long enough to find his successor. Li Yunmu held the Emperor's goblet in his hand. He had already thought of a suitable candidate for the Ryukyu inheritance, and it was Zhu Qingzi. At that moment, he was residing in Li Yunmu's heavenly world, and he had awakened a sword body. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu used a sword, so Zhu Qingzi was the most suitable candidate for the Emperor's goblet. After all, it could no longer assist Li Yunmu based on his realm, but Zhu Qingzi would certainly take Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's Dao to new heights and could be a good disciple for him. Li Yunmu summoned Zhu Qingzi. The young man's brain was comparable to that of a 10-year-old child, and when he saw Li Yunmu, he quickly knelt in front of him. "Respectful greetings, Master Yunmu." Zhu Qingzi had been hearing about Li Yunmu's deeds every day in the heavenly world and had also seen a statue of him, so he could naturally recognize him. But he was extremely curious why Li Yunmu had called him. In his eyes, Li Yunmu's existence was similar to that of a god, while he was only an ordinary person, so a confused expression was on his face at that moment. "How's your cultivation proceeding in the heavenly world?" Li Yunmu asked in a cold voice. Li Yunmu felt a hint of guilt toward Zhu Qingzi whenever he saw him because he was closely related to the reason behind Zhu Qingzi's present state. It was also the reason why Li Yunmu hadn't gone to see Zhu Qingzi for so long, regardless of how his cultivation proceeded. Li Yunmu didn't intend to check up on him, and even if Zhu Qingzi chose to leave the heavenly world after becoming powerful, Li Yunmu didn't plan to stop him. Reporting to Master, I am presently in the Golden Core stage. Although Zhu Qingzi possessed a sword body, when all was said and done, his mind was still that of a 10-year-old child, so he was extremely afraid of Li Yunmu. Zhu Qingzi's words left Li Yunmu gobsmacked. He hadn't expected that in such a short period, Zhu Qingzi would reach the Golden Core stage, but it was as expected of an innate sword body. It was extremely terrifying. But Li Yunmu didn't intend to strangle Zhu Qingzi in the cradle. Worst came to worst, when he came to find Li Yunmu for his revenge, Li Yunmu would have to defeat him. Thus, Li Yunmu took out the Emperor's goblet and passed it to Zhu Qingzi. The youth sensed that it was extremely formidable, and a joyful expression appeared on his face. Zhu Qingzi then knelt once more. "Many thanks to Master for the reward. I will definitely not disappoint you." Li Yunmu sent him back to the heavenly world while mumbling, "Wouldn't disappoint me, huh? Seems like you'll become an extremely formidable enemy." Li Yunmu didn't continue thinking about this matter. Instead, he sat down cross-legged and took out the notebook containing the experiences of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu regarding pill concocting. It was the wealth left behind by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu for him, and Li Yunmu intended to leave only after digesting this knowledge. Just as Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu said, Li Yunmu didn't want to ruin his master's title of Medicine Emperor. As a disciple of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, how could he not have knowledge about pill concocting? You have already seen Zhu Qingzi's development. I'm surprised that you didn't choose to strangle him in the cradle. Instead, you actually gave him the Emperor's goblet. Aren't you afraid? The system asked in his head. The system, of course, knew that the Emperor's goblet wasn't of much use to Li Yunmu because he was already on the way to a breakthrough after receiving the guidance of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. The best period to use the Emperor's goblet was in the immortal realm, so it was too late. It was the reason why Li Yunmu didn't hesitate when handing it over, but the system hadn't expected that he would give it to Zhu Qingzi and couldn't help but warn him. What are you afraid of? Afraid that he will surpass me? If that really happens, then I am just a trash, so what's the harm in him defeating me? I might as well give him an opportunity to chase after me, Li Yunmu said indifferently. That's also right. A person like you who isn't even afraid of heaven, what else could you be afraid of? But previously, I saw in your future that there will be a person who will become a great hindrance on your cultivation path. After observing for so long, it should be Zhu Qingzi. Li Yunmu nodded. He had already thought about it in his heart. He sighed and continued studying the notes of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. We should let nature take its course. Chapter 978, Chopping Down Yin Devil Sovereign. Li Yunmu continued sitting and studying Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's notes. 1 month passed like that. During this time, the system told him that if he used the experience points, the notes could be directly imprinted in Li Yunmu's brain, but he rejected this proposal. After all, he wasn't only studying the notes but also experiencing Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's difficulties and experiences. 3 more months passed before Li Yunmu closed the notebook and carefully packed it inside the heavenly world. It was the final object left behind by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, and Li Yunmu was extremely cautious so as not to ruin it. Once finished, he stood up and quickly searched for the teleport portal in the void. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu had already explained how to use it, and Li Yunmu soon disappeared. When he reappeared in the Ryukyu Palace Hall, he looked at the large hall. The corpses of the space-time spirits had already dried up with the flow of time as their blood entered the spirit refining formation. Li Yunmu was standing in the hall while constantly shaking his head. His goal right then was the remnant soul of the Yin Devil Sovereign hidden in the Ryukyu Spirit Hall. Since Master couldn't deal with you, then allow me, his disciple, to strike you down. Li Yunmu mumbled. Li Yunmu quickly found the place where Yin Devil Sovereign was hidden. The remnant of his soul was staying at the top of Ryukyu Palace Hall. The entire Ryukyu Palace Hall had been transformed into a large spell formation by Yin Devil Sovereign, and the summit was its core. Yin Devil Sovereign was sitting there, absorbing the souls of young talents he killed. When Li Yunmu saw the Yin Devil Sovereign's remnant soul, he was gobsmacked, because in front of him, there was only a meatball. It looked extremely sinister and had countless veins and arteries, which were continuously throbbing, present on its surface. The meatball seemed to sense Li Yunmu's presence. It released an enormous pressure to suppress him, but Li Yunmu had been taught by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, so this little bit of pressure couldn't do anything to him. Li Yunmu only jolted slightly, and the pressure of Yin Devil Emperor was shattered. GG, I haven't seen such a formidable soul in a very long time. Youngster, have you come to become my nourishment? The meatball said in an extremely sinister voice and a vicious smile. Its appearance suggested that he wanted to gobble up Li Yunmu. I have come to destroy you. Li Yunmu looked at the meatball and recalled the matter of Yin Devil Sovereign trying to possess Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's body. It instantly infuriated him. Ha ha ha, you are very interesting, youngster. Do you know who I am? The meatball didn't feel that Li Yunmu was very powerful. In his eyes, he was only a slightly more formidable Great Principal Golden Immortal. But he didn't know that it was only because Li Yunmu's realm hadn't advanced. His combat strength at that moment could already be considered as somewhat more formidable than that of Heavenly Emperors. Yin Devil Sovereign's remnant soul was equivalent to a half-step emperor. He felt that Li Yunmu was only a minor character whom he could casually pinch to death, so he continued to sneer. A trifling remnant soul also dares to be arrogant in front of me? Truly reckless. Li Yunmu coldly smiled. He was unable to control his emotions. When he thought about the injury given by the Yin Devil Emperor which had resulted in his master's death, Li Yunmu's fury rose to the next level. He had no wish to continue talking rubbish and summoned the solitary ignition sword with his thought. He mumbled an incantation. Once the sword's energy appeared, and a sea of fire appeared instantly above them. It went straight toward Yin Devil Emperor. A lowly insect. What kind of flame is this? Youngster, what are you doing? Yin Devil Sovereign saw Li Yunmu attack, but he still couldn't sense his strength. After all, for the past countless years, the immortal realm had been the ceiling of cultivation in the small world. No emperor-level powerhouse had never entered it. Because of that, he didn't pay much attention to what was being done and even used his body to resist Li Yunmu's attack. But what left him surprised was that Li Yunmu's attack was extremely formidable. With just one attack, the Yin Devil Emperor's soul, which had recovered somewhat, was injured again. Moreover, the injury this time was more severe compared to the past. Li Yunmu coldly smiled, not intending to give Yin Devil Sovereign any chance. The solitary ignition sword was covered in flames, and one after another, sword energy slashes struck Yin Devil Sovereign's body. His injuries turned heavy in no time. This type of attack, you are an Emperor Realm powerhouse. No. That can't be. But your presence indicates that you are only an immortal, so how can your attacks be so powerful? Yin Devil Sovereign roared. At that moment, he could finally sense the strength behind Li Yunmu's attack. Panic filled him, since he had never expected that an emperor would surprisingly appear in the small world. There had been a half-emperor called Yin Emperor, but he had never been able to sense Yin Devil Sovereign's existence. Moreover, he could not enter Yin Imperial Palace. Yin Devil Sovereign was extremely confused, but he suddenly thought of something. You are in the immortal realm but have the strength of a heavenly emperor. You are that scoundrel Ryukyu. Yin Devil Sovereign roared because he couldn't think of anyone else who possessed such strength while being in the immortal realm. You surprisingly dare to mention my master's name. I must kill you today, Li Yunmu said with a sneer. Your master? So that little thing that snuck inside a few days ago was you? I hadn't expected that you would go to the place of that scoundrel Ryukyu. It seems like he had nurtured you well. When Yin Devil Emperor heard Li Yunmu call Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu his master, he understood everything. He hadn't expected that Li Yunmu would surprisingly possess such formidable potential and grown so strong in a short time. I should have exterminated you at that time, humph. That old bastard Ryukyu, I shouldn't have left him alive. Yin Devil Sovereign said with hatred in his voice. Although he was unable to do anything to Li Yunmu, he still didn't intend to die. He circulated the energy in his body and ignited a large spell. Want to kill me? You also won't survive. Go die, youngster. After those words, the large spell shattered with a bang, and a loud explosion occurred in the Yin Imperial Palace. Li Yunmu rushed forward. This level of explosion couldn't affect the present him. A sneer was even on his lips. Using old tricks, do you think I am an idiot? Li Yunmu discovered that a wisp of Yin Devil Sovereign's soul had attached itself on the solitary ignition sword. Fortunately, Li Yunmu knew about this, or else Yin Devil Sovereign would have been able to escape. Li Yunmu covered the solitary ignition sword with a flame, and the wisp of Yin Devil Sovereign's soul dissipated. Death Goddess will take revenge for me. May the glory remain with me. Chapter 979, Unbridled Xiao Rong. At that moment, Li Yunmu began to frown. Who is this death goddess that Yin Devil Sovereign is talking about? Li Yunmu shook his head. Figures of endless enemies appeared in his heart to the point of almost overwhelming him, but regardless of whoever it was, as long as they obstructed his path, he would definitely cut them down. Li Yunmu once more looked at the ruins of Yin Imperial Palace and took a deep bow toward it. Master, I killed your mortal enemy in your place. I hope that you rest peacefully now. At that moment, Li Yunmu couldn't help but think of the days he spent in the void. He recalled the teachings of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, and warmth filled his eyes. But Li Yunmu quickly raised his head, not allowing tears to flow out. He calmed his heart by recalling Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's words that a powerhouse should maintain the appearance of a powerhouse. He leapt on an arrow and disappeared in the sky above the ruins of Yin Imperial Palace, then proceeded toward the master city of Ryukyu's small world. By that point, 10 years had already passed since Yin Imperial Palace was opened. Xiao Rong, with whom Li Yunmu had entered the Yin Imperial Palace, had already returned to the master city. Actually, Xiao Rong had to thank Li Yunmu profusely for being able to come out alive. If Li Yunmu hadn't destroyed his 2 protective charms while he was trying to fight over the solitary ignition sword, he would have become a sacrifice in the Ryukyu Palace Hall. But because of losing all his protection charms, Rong abhorred Li Yunmu. When he arrived in front of Ryukyu Palace Hall, he didn't enter inside because of various apprehensions and instead waited for someone who had entered to come out, so he could forcefully relieve them of their treasures. After coming out, he also asked his father, City Master Xiao, to stay with him at the exit to kill Li Yunmu. But they were disappointed by the fact that apart from some of the people who had entered with him, not only Li Yunmu, even the other young talents never walked out. Because of that, Rong believed that Li Yunmu had died in the Ryukyu Palace Hall with the other young talents and gradually forgot about him. 10 years passed in a flash, and Rong used the cultivation resources obtained from the Yin Imperial Palace to reach the true immortal realm. After becoming a powerhouse, he became even more unbridled compared to before. Previously, he still had to rely on his father, City Master Xiao, who was a golden immortal. But it was no longer the case. He had become an immortal, so even without relying on his father, City Master Xiao, he could walk tall across the Ryukyu small world with his strength. That is as long as he didn't provoke the big S.H.A.D.W who had been famous for a long time. Just like everyone under the Emperor realm was considered an ant by those powerhouses, the same principle could also be applied to the immortal realm. Everyone was an ant in front of a true immortal because there weren't many people like Li Yunmu who could fight with enemies with higher cultivation. Someone like that might not even appear in several tens of thousands of years, so in the eyes of the cultivators of Ryukyu's small world, a true immortal was a paramount existence. Even if Rong had just recently stepped into immortal realm, those under the immortal realm couldn't compare with him. Because of that, despite everyone being furious about his actions, no one dared to complain about anything that he did. Rong kicked a small vendor's booth and then kicked the small vendor. Without any power to resist, the vendor began to cough mouthfuls of blood. Rong saw everyone looking at him with fearful gazes and burst out laughing, then said to the small vendor, "You trash, you surprisingly dare to obstruct the path of your daddy. It looks like you are tired of living." He exerted some force in his legs, and the sound of bone cracking echoed in everyone's ears. The small vendor lost consciousness, and his breath began to disappear. The injured man was only a small cultivator who had stepped on the path of cultivation just recently, so even if Rong didn't use any Shen energy, the kick of an immortal wasn't something he could endure. The people in the surroundings were pointing fingers of blame, but no one dared to step forward and help the small vendor. It wasn't that they didn't want to, but that they didn't dare. When Rong swept his gaze over them, they lowered their heads in fear, not daring to meet his eyes. The rumors of Rong's arrogance had been spreading across the Master City for a long time. Whoever dared to resist him had only one path in front of them, and it led straight to an early death. Because of that, no one dared to put their life in danger to get the small vendor out of his predicament. Finally, one person couldn't continue watching. He was more than 8 feet tall, and his strong body made it obvious that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Moreover, he was also a disciple of a large sect. But that sect was still weaker than the Master City, so he didn't dare to step out straight away. When he set out, his master had repeatedly urged him to not provoke the imposing city master of Ryukyu City. But that muscular man still took a step forward because he couldn't continue watching. Despite his crude body, he was an extremely kind-hearted man, so how could he continue watching Rong bullying someone in front of him? Rong saw that someone had surprisingly dared to oppose him, and it infuriated him greatly, but when he saw the person who had come forward, a sneer appeared on his face. Ryukyu Master City was the small world's most powerful faction, and their strength had increased more when Rong reached the immortal realm, so they didn't put the other powers in their eyes. I know you, Quick Thunder Sect's second senior apprentice, but you aren't my opponent. If your master comes, then I can exchange pointers with him. Whether I am your opponent or not, that is something that we will know after we fight. Rong, you have committed grave injustice. If City Master learned about it, he would come to punish you. Even if Rong was an immortal, the muscular man didn't intend to retreat. He released his presence, and a powerful pressure spread out, which made the ordinary people in the surroundings to look at him with astonishment in their eyes. They had guessed that the muscular man was a powerhouse, but they hadn't expected that his strength would be so formidable. Based on the powerful pressure coming from his body, he was already at the quasi-immortal realm. After another few days, he could become an immortal realm powerhouse thus, so the surrounding people felt deep admiration for the muscular man for daring to step forward. However, they also felt that he was quite pitiful because his potential wasn't the least bit inferior to Rong's, but Rong's background was extremely deep. As the son of City Master Xiao, he had access to a large amount of cultivation resources. Furthermore, he had also found many types of cultivation resources which only existed in the past in the Yin Imperial Palace. It allowed him to leave all the people of the same generation far behind him. So how could Quick Thunder Sect's second apprentice brother be his opponent? If he had cultivated for several more years, then no one could guess who was stronger and who was weaker, but he showed up too early. Everyone sighed. Since the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect had stepped out, he would definitely be killed by Rong. They wanted to shout for the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect to return, but they were extremely afraid of Rong's revenge, so no one dared to speak out. Rong coldly looked at the muscular man with a disdainful expression on his face. At that moment, the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect couldn't even resist one attack from him. Rong's kick sent the small vendor flying, and the man coughed out mouthfuls of blood once more. Many pieces of internal organs were also mixed with the blood. The kick sent him into a wall, and his head fell to the side. He was already dead. Rong then disdainfully looked at the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect and extended his hand, provoking him to attack. After the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect saw this, his expression became even more furious. He immediately took a proper posture and kicked the ground before rushing towards Rong. At the same time, his most powerful technique appeared in his hand. But none of his actions were worth a second glance in Rong's eyes. Even when the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect launched a punch toward him, the sneer on his face did not disappear. He let the punch land on his body without any intention to evade it. Chapter 980, Li Yunmu's whereabouts. When the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect saw the attack was about to land on Rong's body, his face filled with delight. He had cultivated a strength path so the might of each of his punches was extremely formidable and even quasi-immortal powerhouses wouldn't dare to resist them head-on. The second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect began to imagine the scene of Rong being beaten by him and spoke up. "You surprisingly dare to be so brazen and take my attack head-on? This time, even if you don't die, you will be heavily injured." But the next instant, the complacent expression on his face disappeared. He sensed his punch having slammed into an iron board. In an instant, his hand bones shattered, while Rong surprisingly wasn't injured in the least. The second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect was greatly startled and spoke with incredulity in his voice. "Impossible, even if you are a true immortal, your defense shouldn't be so formidable." "I indeed don't have such a formidable defense, but I have this." Rong, with a relaxed expression on his face, pulled apart his clothes, revealing jet-black inner armor. It was a treasure he had obtained during the trip to Yin Imperial Palace. Based on City Master Xiao's personal test, the inner armor could even block the attacks of golden immortal powerhouses. Even if Rong was attacked by them, he wouldn't receive any life-threatening injury. So how could someone like the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect, who was only a quasi-immortal, break this kind of defense? Rong wasn't afraid that others would learn about his secret because the immortal realm was already the limit in the Ryukyu small world, so no one could break his inner armor. On the contrary, Rong wanted even more people to know that he possessed unparalleled defense since it would rise his reputation even higher. Rong didn't attack immediately, but instead tidied up his clothes. His figure then flashed and arrived in front of his target. With a punch, the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect was sent flying. Rong then turned into countless shadows that kept attacking the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect from all sides. When he stopped, all the meridians in the body of the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect had ruptured, and he was lying on the ground paralyzed. He had never been an opponent of Rong, and on top of that, Rong had extremely powerful inner armor. With a ruthless expression on his face, Rong put his foot on the head of the second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect. He then bent down and leaned over him as if looking at an ant. Many of the people who saw it couldn't help but gulp down their saliva. Should I admire your courage? Or should I say you are stupid? You dared to set yourself against me when your Quick Thunder Sect couldn't protect you. After he finished speaking, Rong exerted force in his foot and crushed the head of second apprentice brother of Quick Thunder Sect. Instantly, blood splattered everywhere, splashing on the face of people standing in the surroundings. Do you see it? This is the outcome of those who dare to set themselves against me. Rong coldly looked at the people in the surroundings. His action made the onlookers retreat. They were afraid that the vile monster would set his sight on them next. Just when Rong was enjoying the moment, a city guard from the gate rushed over and respectfully saluted. Informing the young city master, the guards of Western Gate have reported that a criminal for which the sire had issued a warrant long ago has come. And? What criminal? At that moment, Rong had been enjoying himself, but the guard had interrupted him and fouled his mood. When he heard that the city guard had seen a criminal who had been listed as wanted a few years ago, he was puzzled. The city master hadn't listed anyone as wanted in the past several years. Suddenly, Rong recalled that when he had gone to the Yin Imperial Palace, he had been forced to flee because of Li Yunmu's threat. Since Li Yunmu hadn't come out at that time, he and his father had been unable to catch him. After returning to the master city, Rong issued a warrant against him. But no one could ever find Li Yunmu, and as time passed, he also forgot about this matter, so the warrant was withdrawn. When Rong heard the guard's report, he remembered it all of a sudden. That Li Yunmu who had humiliated him countless times in the Yin Imperial Palace had actually come to the master city. Rong became extremely excited after hearing that. The onlookers shook their heads. Based on Rong's smiling face, they were certain that someone was going to suffer a miserable fate. At that moment, Rong was thinking about how he could finally take his revenge. Before, whenever he thought about the incident with Li Yunmu in the Yin Imperial Palace, he couldn't help but sigh regretfully because he couldn't personally kill Li Yunmu. It always filled him with regret. The news was thus incredibly joyous. Li Yunmu had surprisingly dared to appear in the city, and Rong was already a true immortal. He began to rejoice in his heart that he would be able to personally defeat Li Yunmu. In his excitement, he totally forgot that in the Yin Imperial Palace, his two protective charms which could even resist the attacks of Great Principal Golden Immortal had been casually shattered by Li Yunmu. Rong's strength had increased greatly, so he had become extremely arrogant and put Li Yunmu's strength out of his mind. He believed that Li Yunmu was only a cultivator slightly more powerful than him at that time. Rong hurriedly sent people to search for Li Yunmu's whereabouts. He was afraid that he would escape though, so he also rushed toward the Western Gate. While midway to the Western Gate, as luck would have it, he encountered Li Yunmu. At that moment, Li Yunmu was sitting in a restaurant. He had planned to leave the Ryukyu small world after leaving the Yin Imperial Palace, but during the journey, he again saw the Master City. Li Yunmu recalled that before entering the Yin Imperial Palace, he had intended to wipe out City Master Xiao, so he decided to make a small detour. He ordered a bit of food and was busy eating at that moment. This family restaurant's chef can be considered to be pretty good. While Li Yunmu was eating, someone came over to disturb him. His complexion turned unpleasant, and he raised his head to see a face which he found quite repulsive. What do you want? Li Yunmu asked indifferently. This lord, I wonder whether you remember me. The moment Rong saw Li Yunmu, his attitude became even more arrogant. Because Li Yunmu had restrained his presence, Rong couldn't sense his strength. Li Yunmu frowned. He didn't know who the person in front of him was. Rong was like an ant in front of him, so he didn't bother to remember his face, and that time, he had been shocked by the solitary ignition sword, which arrested his full attention. Li Yunmu could not recognize Rong, and he asked with suspicion, "Who are you? You unexpectedly don't remember me. Seems like you are really a lunatic. Back then, you destroyed 2 of my protective charms and now you surprisingly dare to ask who I am? Should I admire your courage or what?" Rong was bursting with rage. He hadn't expected that Li Yunmu would actually not even remember him. Could it be that he was worth nothing in his eyes? In a fit of fury, Rong suddenly flipped over the table on which Li Yunmu's food was placed. Li Yunmu's expression turned dark at the sight of it. Rong burst out laughing after courting disaster. Li Yunmu also smiled, then casually waved his hand. A beam of energy turned into a punch and quickly rushed forward. It arrived in front of Rong in a blink of an eye. Before Rong could react, the attack slammed into his chest. The next instant, Rong coughed up blood and was sent flying. When he slammed against the ground, Li Yunmu slowly stood up. He looked at Rong with a cold expression. The killing intent in his body rose to the peak.